And the labor leaders were concerned that kids in the workforce, when there was a lot of immigration into the United States, were depressing the wages, and so they were in favor of universal education. So all these factors came in to kickstart universal education. So my thought became, and something is obviously being missed out, right? It's not only democracy and everybody should have education. So that's what led to the book. And then what I started seeing, even in the world of communications, was people would focus on the marginalized poor people or people in rural areas and how universal service, that was the words used in those days, for telephone service will benefit them. And then they'll talk about the system benefit in very general terms. They would use the word network externalities. That is, the whole idea that the bigger the network, the more valuable for it is. But it's kind of in a very general way. So I thought that was not covering all the issues involved. So I started looking, the book basically argues you have to look at not only to the benefits to the beneficiaries and to the cost to the systems. So they will talk about how much it will cost and the benefit of the system, but you also have to look at the cost to the beneficiary, because the beneficiary also has costs, psychological, financial, and so on. So that's what the book is. It says, and the endeavor is to have an honest conversation. You have to understand everything. So that's, I can go on, but you've given me too much a wide question. So yeah.
So you have a service,
Yeah.
whether it's education or electricity.
Yeah.
You have an intended beneficiary,
Right.
and they have some gains, but
Right.
there are some downsides to them. They travail.
Yeah.
In general, there are some benefits to the system in providing that
Yeah.
service, and there's some costs to the system.
Right.
But then you also introduced another very interesting concept. You call it recentering on reversal,
Right.
which I interpret to mean, okay, in pursuit of this, there were some unintended consequences. And if we had focused on that peripheral issue and put it at the center, would we have done something differently?
Right. So what happens in the book is, so we wanted to understand fully not only what was discussed and articulated, we also wanted to understand what was not articulated. And so what we did was we developed this methodology. Actually, is inspired by Phil Agri, who was a professor at University of California at Irvine, UCLA. I make a big mistake. He was at UCLA. And he was informed, of course, by other scholars, but we made it very explicit. So we were very interested in the biggest point here, and I'll explain the methodology because Ralph has found the methodology to be of interest, is that we wanted to understand blind spots. And what I also did a search in the literature on public policy, and I've been around public policy literature for the last 35 years. And I found they don't really discuss blind spots. People discuss all the debates and this and that, and it's much later you realize something everybody missed out, right? So we wanted to understand blind spots. So what we did was, basically the idea is any thought pattern or any settled way of thinking or a paradigm has a generative metaphor or something central idea out of which all the secondary ideas are derived from. And the nature of that is that every generative metaphor also has a blind spot, because that's the nature of metaphors. They illuminate some things and other things get left out. And what happens is things which don't fit in that framework are ignored, because they'll just rubbish it away or they'll explain it away. They won't pay attention. So what we did was, wherever we noticed there was something amiss, we used that as the anchor and try to look at the situation from that anchor. And what we are saying is the settled pattern is not wrong, it's only partial, right? So you have a complementary pattern. Reality, as human beings, we can never fully understand the universe, right? So any pattern is going to be bounded, but you have old pattern, and then you have an alternative, another pattern which complements or not complements, but expands and understanding. So that's what we did. So what, in a way, the book is a compilation of not only what people said in any situation, wherever we could find, we did a very wide search, but we also did this reverse recentering on reversal to expand understanding.
Before we talk about what we've learned from the past
Yeah.
and how it can be applied in the future, let's talk a little bit about universal access to electricity as described in the book.
Right.
So in this case, it was really a domestic
Right.
view.
Right.
It was a desire to facilitate electrification in rural areas. There was some competition between
Right.
the integrated utilities that had more of a metropolitan perspective and
Right.
and the rural service providers. Do you want to describe
Yeah.
the
That was actually the first new technology I studied. So I was doing telephone networks, internet. It was not just beginning at that time. And I remember telling my professor, we are so thinking on telecom, and I can tell you why we did this, why I was finding that constraining. And I said, it's electricity is kind of similar. You have these lines of across landscape, and in rural areas, the population is less. We were doing telecommunications in rural areas. And he thought it was very interesting. And so I started reading about electrification in rural areas. And it's an amazing experience because it's an American story in many ways. What was happening was that electrification occurred in cities, and the utilities would not take it to rural areas. And they would say, it's just not sustainable. It costs so much per mile. And if the farmers kept demanding, they would insist that the farmers pay for the line or have contracts which are sufficient to pay back the electricity. And they were looking at rural electrification networks as linear networks of urban networks. And there were some very progressive engineers. This is the New Deal era, FDR is around and so on. And they were saying that, well, it doesn't have to be hugely profitable. As long as it is economically sustainable, we should find a way, which is, again, a very American thing because we don't want a government subsidy all the time here. What they started poking around, and they were utterly unpersuaded by the cost accounting. I'm not a cost accountant, but the cost accounting done by the utilities, and they realized, in any network industry, the fixed cost is very high and the variable cost is low, and how you allocate fixed costs can vary because they found different utilities were doing cost accounting very differently. But anyway, they came out with this approach where they said you can't make rural areas extensions, you have to make rural systems. So they call it area coverage. They said we're going to cover entire areas and we're going to get economies of scale. And the utilities were saying the farmer will use electricity only for 60 watts. That was the metaphor they were using, 60 watts a day in the night. And they were saying no. And they executed it. And they changed the economics of making poles. They said the poles don't have to last forever. They changed the economics of meters, and they went around meter reading. They got farmers to do meter reading. And then they realized appliances are very important. And so they worked with the appliance manufacturers who saw a rural market, and there's the whole gamut of things. And the story is the utilities had totally missed out the latent demand in rural areas. And the reality is, in a rural area, a home is not only a place where people live, but it's also a place of production, where people are conducting farm and doing other things. Yeah.
Well, I was fascinated by one of the unintended consequences, both of electrification and some of the other services you looked at, was that there had been a decline perceived in rural populations, not just perceived, but reality. So bringing these conveniences, whether it's electricity or broadcasting or libraries, to rural areas would enhance the quality of life and restore the population. But in fact, by making farms far more efficient, there was less labor and therefore less of a reason to stay.
It happened across many systems, like even the postal system in some ways expanded. It happened with telephone system. And the thinking was, which is very instructive for our times, they defined the rural problem as a rural deficit. Basically, the rural areas lacked something which the urban areas had. They even used words like civilizational deficit and things like that. And the backdrop to it is, it's around that time when the US was going to become more urban majority than rural majority. And there was this big fear that as America loses its rural areas, American character will be lost. The similar thing had happened when the American migration was occurring across the continent, and the West was going away, basically. And there was a big fear that once Americans reach the Pacific, the American spirit will be dissipated. And so a lot of these programs were driven by those ideas. The idea was that if you make rural life as good as urban life, people won't leave. And the exact opposite happened, case after case. Because one of the things was what Ralph said, is that they looked at the socket and they said, if we have a socket, and then farmer can pump water with this and can do this and that. And they were so thrilled by what that socket can do for the farmer. But they didn't, at one level, they forgot that if every farmer did that, there'll be less need for farm workers in the rural areas, right? And also they looked at their benefits, what they will get. They also forgot that they get integrated into the metropolitan economy. They may gain, but there'll be other players in this integrated economy who will gain much more than them and in asymmetrical ways, which will be not good for them. So they actually ended up not only getting depopulated, which was their biggest fear, it also, there's actually, this is a word, citified the rural areas. The rural areas were no longer rural areas. They became basically extensions of urban life, Yeah.
So let's stick with this basic concept of having access to a socket. By definition, pursuit of universal access suggests that there's a population segment that doesn't have access, and they need to be helped. And oftentimes there's socioeconomic reasons, sometimes there's ideological reasons, sometimes there's geographic reasons that have economic implications. But I forget the statistic. There are many people in the world who do not have access to electricity. That's not the case in the United States right now, but sub-Saharan Africa, certainly. You make the case in your research that universal access is an American export. Yet this morning, I think we heard a little bit more about the importance of connecting 8 billion lives. How do you, from your research, how do you see electrification being pursued at the very basic level in some parts of the world?
So the first, before I get into that question, I'm not against universal service at all. I'm just saying you have to do it in a more thought out manner. So in the rest of the world, as I understand it, till 1980s, all kinds of utilities, including telephones, electricity, were all either run by ministries or government-owned public sector corporations. And the concept was public service. And the idea was that because these are state-oriented enterprises by their very nature, they have an obligation to serve everybody. But in practice, I mean, I don't hope I don't want to offend anybody, but in many parts of the world, it didn't play out for various reasons. And I'm not going to critique the reasons. Maybe later in the evening, if somebody wants, I can give you the reasons, I think. But what you can see it in the world of telephones, landline phones, till the 1980s, in many parts of the world, there were like 1 or 2 per 100. It's kind of crazy looking back, right? But in America, we have a very different model because we have had private companies running utilities for 100 years, more than 100 years. So we developed this concept of universal access. So here the utility as a profit-oriented entity is not by inherent nature obligated to execute public service, but the compact it makes with the society to be given certain privileges like rights of ways and monopolies and so on for laying wires and so on has to execute. So then there's a supervision of somebody held responsible, and this is decoupled, and there's a certain energy of the American adversarial system which primes it. So
So I'm going to articulate a vision that I think is probably commonly held by many in this room. I'll do it by first offering a quiz. It's not a test of your knowledge. It's a test of your honesty. No one's ever failed this quiz. One person did once. He was an employee of mine. And he was just being a smart aleck. And the quiz is simply, How many people woke up this morning and said, I cannot wait to use a kilowatt hour? Right, that's typically the answer that I get from people. How many people woke up this morning and said, if I do have to use a kilowatt hour, I hope it poisons the planet? Oh, okay, so we raised a hand. How many people said that I hope that when I want to use a kilowatt hour and I flip the switch, it's not there? Okay, so everyone passed the quiz. I know I was taking a chance. Everybody's got a full belly. The energy levels are down, but typically that's the way it works. So the vision for the future is that people use only the electricity they need. Right? So if we can have comfort in this room and use less electricity through more efficient appliances, we'd all be happy. Our bills would be lower. If the electricity could be produced more cleanly than ever before, in the old days that meant without soot particles landing on my head. Nowadays it means without carbon dioxide being emitted. And if I can have it not only during blue sky days, but during storms, and it would be more resilient than ever before, I'd be a very happy person. So maybe we're not talking about just having access to a socket. It's less, it's cleaner, and it's more resilient than ever before. We don't have universal access to that in the United States, and I dare say in most parts of the planet today. So how do we learn from some of the impediments that existed in the other systems? Let me offer one. So right now, retail rates and many policies in the US are set at the state level. And yet we heard talk before of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've heard the president speak about electrification of transportation. So we have certain national objectives that are shared to varying degrees at the local level, but not uniformly so. So what happens when regulation has bifurcation? What happens when there appears to be an optimal approach if it's uniform, but you sacrifice some local uniqueness and some of the perhaps conflicting ideologies of different socio-political forms?
So the thing is, in the US, that's how things have always happened till after Civil War. It's become more federal level. So actually, it's not in the book, but I have another, with my colleague, a model on how educations are inspired by how universal education was developed in the United States. We call a layered diffusion model. And I'm just going to read a few passages from my book, if I could indulge it, not very long ones. So like in education, the story goes that started in Massachusetts first, and slowly things spread from Massachusetts. But so like, I'm just going to read 4 or 5 lines here, and then maybe another passage somewhere here. So over time, the colonies increased the minimum level of education specified in the universal education laws. 1642 Massachusetts law specified that all children should be taught to read. That was all. In 1660, New Haven colony, there was a new colony called New Haven. Now we have a city called New Haven, added a writing requirement. Subsequently, colonies expanded the scope of universal education to history, geography, geometry, and so on. And so what happens in the US is because we have a federal system with very decentralized, each one famous judge had called it Brandeis, I guess, their laboratories of democracy. And innovation occurs here, then the other states copy, and then that's how the innovation spread. And we are all seeing also in education right now. So like, I'm going to read a few more lines. So in 2014, Tennessee launched a program for tuition-free education at a community college in the first 2 years of college. And now Oregon launched after that, and now Arkansas, Delaware, Kentucky, and the many other states. So in America, things happen in an incremental way. States are copying each other. That doesn't mean there's no scope for federal action. There are certain things only the federal government can do, especially if it's some kind of a market, a national-wide market they want to set. So that's my very broad response to you.
Yeah, I was impressed. I did not know that Horace Mann was a pioneer in that regard. Yeah, it was also encouraging to me because every once in a while, I tend to get a little bit pessimistic about some of the polarization that's occurring in our country. And it's nice to know that it was in 1640 that there were disagreements over how education should be designed in different colonies. And even today, we have that debate going on in certain states about what is and what isn't a legitimate curriculum. I also found it fascinating. I think in broadcasting, there was this issue as well, right? Do you allow networks to decide what programming to offer?
Right.
And I can never tell if the microphone's going out because the folks who are running it don't like what we're saying, or if it's good. But in broadcasting, there was a similar local versus network issue, was there not?
Right. So there also it kind of backfires because the whole American broadcasting regulatory approach was to preserve what they called local public sphere. So they thought if they had radio stations in every little community, it'll create local programming and there'll be a local voice. They didn't realize that there'll be networking developed because the transmitters will get centrally connected. And then once the network developed, it made the receiving nodes more and more passive because it was more and more convenient for a network like NBC or CBS to develop high quality programming. It depends on how you define quality, and generate the advertising revenue. And basically, it destroyed the local public sphere. The bigger story there is that when radio first came in, the corporations thought broadcasting was a nuisance because the corporations were bent upon developing telegraph, and it was called the wireless because they thought it'll be an extension of the wired network. The wired network could not reach ships, and the radio was broadcasting was actually understood by young boys in those days, teenagers. They started playing music in their garages, and then their friends started listening to them. These are the predecessors of today's hackers, and they started sending each other postcards, play these music. And then somebody at Westinghouse realized, hey, this is interesting, and there's a development of broadcasting. But at some point, there were thousands of radio stations in the United States, and there were churches and schools and so on. But once the networks come in, they just squeeze out everything else. So the bigger story there is how much of messiness you allow to exist and how much of systemized, centralized planning you allow to exist. And it's, I think, very pertinent for today's issues in electricity, because there was a discussion on our table. There's a talk about mini grids, and then there are going to be these giant networks, and then what will happen in the future. And my bet is initially there will be a lot of mini grids. Also happened in telephone because utilities wouldn't go into rural areas. Farmers literally started stringing wire and making their own networks. But once, and there's a longer story, of course I can go into details. Once AT&T became dominant, everything got choked out. And so the issue is how much of balance between messiness and highly organized systems. And I know the grid is a very complex, system, and it's not used to too much of variance. But as new energy sources are coming, one of the big things is what do you plug in? I think the honest thing for the electric industry would be to understand how much of messiness is technically possible and how much you're willing to live with. So, yeah.
So I do want to explore the AT&T learnings a little.
There's a lot of parallel,
yeah. But so states can learn from each other if they have reasonably consistent ideological perspectives on what needs to take place. But even if they do, in the case of renewable energy, there may not be access to the resource. You have some states that are windier than others, and some locations that are sunnier than others. A way to bridge that gap and provide universal access is through massive infrastructure of transmission. So I don't know if there's a parallel between that and the long lines of AT&T.
I don't know. I can tell you the long lines of AT&T. I know there's a lot of interconnect, and there was early morning discussion interconnecting Norway and Denmark, or what is it, Britain, under the ocean. So the story at the AT&T story, the story to learn there is AT&T ignores rural areas, just like the utilities do. And actually, the AT&T story happened before the electrification story. Farmers just started making their own networks. Initially, AT&T ignored them, but then the farmers started expanding into urban areas, the nearest small town, because the farmer had to connect with the agricultural supplier and so on. And there were about 20,000 these small telephone entities, and they became half the US market. And then AT&T woke up, and their strategy was making long lines. And the Theodore Vail, who was the architect of the Bell system, he thought if they interconnected all the AT&T's local networks and they made a national network, nobody could compete with them, which was true. And this was the blind spot of the small telephone companies, because they were growing nearby and they thought, hey, we're expanding. But once they had to expand further, they just couldn't. Yeah.
So I want to come back to the geographic differences in a few minutes, but one of the areas that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is universal access when it's being limited by economic differences, even at the same location.
Right.
Somebody who can versus somebody who cannot afford to buy something. A classic example nowadays would be rooftop solar.
Right.
The attempts to build community solar in those areas where the adequate to provide the power, but perhaps people cannot afford the panels. Another example would be energy efficiency, that highly efficient dishwasher, that washing machine, that air conditioning unit that will save people money over the long term costs more money up front, and therefore people may not be able to afford it at that point. How have prior systems overcome the income disparities that get in the way of universal access?
So in the world of telephones and internet, they tried it, and I don't think it was successful. I may be wrong. They tried creating community centers. So the idea was you can't have it in the home, but you could have it in the community. So maybe there could be a neighborhood mini grid. I mean, people pool in money instead of having on their rooftop, they have it in the neighborhood. So that's the one which comes to my mind. I know the REA also, the Rural Electrification Administration, also gave loans for inside wiring and things like that. So that's the other part of it.
In general, though, in prior systems has social support networks or subsidies, if I may use the word, been an effective method, or has it really been dependent upon technology reducing prices to the point where greater access was doable?
I can't give you a definite answer on that, but I have another parallel there, because what happens in the world of telephones is that actually, and this is something to be learned here, there was a lot of fog on what universal access actually meant. And I have a sense, same thing is in the electrification world right now, at least the things I've been trying to read. So for example, AT&T in the 80s was saying that AT&T philosophy was one system, one policy, universal service. And the idea was that only if AT&T had a monopoly, it could cross-subsidize and it could make sure everybody has telephone service. And one of the pieces of scholarship I personally respect a lot, by a book by Milton Mueller, he actually went into the old archives, and of all things, AT&T archives, and he made the case, and very convincingly, actually, AT&T mythology was that's what Theodore Vail had articulated the philosophy. Actually, what Theodore Vail was saying was he wanted all the networks to interconnect, because when there were multiple small networks, many cities had 2-3 competing networks, and if you had one telephone network, you couldn't talk to the other. And AT&T wanted, basically he was saying the only way everybody can talk to everybody is by giving me a monopoly. He did not mean that everybody should have telephone service. Why? Because you can see he was not willing to go into rural areas, right? So he didn't mean that. So what happens in telephones is, and why did AT&T in the 80s started saying this? Because it was facing antitrust lawsuit, which eventually led to the breakup of AT&T. So it was trying to justify its monopoly. So what's the silent story of universal access in telephones, right? So what happens is till World War World War II, only about 50% of the population has telephone service in the United States. And in the 65 onwards till 1980 is where the real thing takes off. It reaches 95. It happens in a very quiet, technocratic way. And what happens is that basically the regulators decide that all the cost savings from the technological advances in long distance communications are going to be used to subsidize universal service, because the last mile problem is there in many systems. Same thing in telephones, it's the most expensive. And the politicians liked it because it kept people happy with low rates. And the FCC had the technocratic, because allocating money is also a complex thing. And the whole thing was very quiet. Nobody talked about universal service till the antitrust laws action came into existence. So, yeah.
I failed to mention, I should have, that we will take questions if there are some in the group. I know that we're live streaming. We'll just repeat the question for the remote audience. One of the fascinating components of the systems you studied, I found, was the postal system.
Yeah.
And how much it affected life in rural America, literally changing people's addresses and creating a grid that they never thought of on their own.
Right.
How difficult or how compelling does the case need to be for the system-wide deployment, the universal access, to actually change things at such a basic level as it was in the postal system? Is that something that's just done by force of law, or is it a sales job?
It's the logic of big capital, So what happens, so those are the costs. So what happens is that when the rural areas start getting postal system, the issue was delivering the mail to individual farmers' homes. So earlier the farmers had to go to the nearby post office to pick up the mail. And when the postal system starts delivering the mail, they would require the rural areas to have a logical addressing system, right? And it happens even now when the emergency services started going to rural areas. So in many parts of the world, the addressing system is not very logical in our sense. I got totally lost in one place because addressing system was such a different logic, which I didn't understand. Logic could be because this number house is 1, this number is 3, 2, and this is 3. It doesn't make sense to me, but this is grandfather's, this is father's, and this is mine, right? And you had to have a uniform addressing system because it was now part of a system, and now the mail van had to come, and the mail carrier did not have to know the local address. And then also now the mail carrier had to wear a uniform because it's no longer a local mail carrier, and now you have system flows going through the rural area. So this is also how they totally lost being part of rural, because in rural areas, one of the saving graces is everybody knows everybody, right? And so they became a part of a very decontextualized grid system, basically. So that's a cost. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it fascinating how much benefit there was to non-local participants, whether it was mail order catalogs and magazines and various other participants. But it seemed that in all of the 7 systems you studied, the take I had was that the motivation was primarily to bring a benefit to the individual class that did not have access. Was there ever a time when, no, the motivation was the benefits to the system?
Yeah, I think mostly it was benefits to the system.
You do?
Not articulated. Mostly universal access starts when it becomes in the interest of the powerful people. Not always, though, because sometimes, like I mentioned, farmers forcing the hand of utilities by taking actions on their own. So actually the book argues there are 2 logics playing out in these universal access. One is the logic of inclusion, that everybody should be included. And everybody talks about that, and it's in everybody's interest, And there's a beauty to it, and you can see the farmers wanting telephone service is also in their logic of inclusion. But there's also a logic of binding. That is, you want to bind everybody into the logic of the system, like the grid we saw. right? And that is never articulated. So like I mentioned earlier, the powerful people, the patricians of Boston, if you want to use a typical metaphoric, stereotype, didn't want new immigrants to destabilize the American political system, or even the libraries. They thought the libraries will keep people away from the pubs or the bars, and they called it the asylum of the drunk, or and so on. So all these systems were made to stabilize. And in fact, Horace Mann, you mentioned, I'm sure his motivations were good, from what I can make out. But one of the ways he had to build a coalition to everybody to support universal education. One of the things which really struck me was the metaphor he used. He went and told the rich that education is the balance wheel of society, which really struck me, because in the world of education, we always talk about questioning and critical understanding and so on. So he was basically saying that the educated people are unlikely to create problem. In fact, they were sold even as an antidote to strikes, because in the late 1800s, there were a lot of strikes, railroad strikes and so on. Irish immigrants, and other Italian immigrants and groups, they were revolting. So it was seen, and there have been places where the teacher has been equated to a policeman or a constable. So what happens in these debates is the celebratory logic is the logic of inclusion. And I'm sure even the people who have other logics at play, like the logic of binding, look at all our motivations as human beings. They're always complex, they're always good and selfish. And we always foreground the more, which is the celebratory. And I think it does not lead to an honest discussion. I am accepting, in fact, I think the enlightened way of getting universal education, like even electrification, is people are saying a lot of things, and to me seems very diffuse. I may be wrong, but it's got loaded with a lot of things going on. I think the trick would be to find the sweet spot where a lot of interests intersect in ways which can be leveraged fruitfully, and to understand that sweet spot of intersection, and to come up with a compelling metaphor, a compelling vocabulary to activate that impulse.
So let's talk a little bit, because you raised the interesting topic of the library system, about what we mean by universal access. I think the statistic you quote in the book is that 25% of Americans have never been to their public library.
It's more than that. I forgot.
50% don't use it regularly.
25, right? They're 25, yeah.
So even though there's some tens of thousands of public libraries, this is maybe not as relevant in the internet age, but it was relevant once upon a time. What do we mean by universal access? Does it simply mean that individuals have the opportunity, or does it mean that they actually use it? Right. Because there are implications for electricity, right? If we want to make clean, carbon-free energy available, but not require its use, that has some significant implications for climate change.
Right. I think that is the most telling example in the whole book. I'm, so thrilled you put your finger. You said you're brilliant. But, you are, of course. I don't want to be facile about it. But that is the most telling example. Why? Because, so what is universal access? It's just the opportunity, right? So if you when they created the telecenters, where the idea was you create community networks and people will go and use the network. If you can't get it in the home, people wouldn't go there. Is that universal access? And it's also very telling, because what the library community does, and library does a lot of good things. I'm not criticizing. I know the libraries are, a lot of people have they're very big friends of libraries. I also use libraries, but it's very telling, because what they do is they will openly acknowledge, if you look at their reports, they'll openly acknowledge 25% people never come to the library, never, ever, right? And then 50% come only 2-3 times a year. And then they'll focus on all the activities they'll do, and they'll provide all kind of statistics about, like how much per user, what activity. So my deeper question is just that. So is the obligation done that, okay, we have given them an opportunity, and they'll say how much driving distance, and it's very interesting. It's only 15, 20 miles. I forget the statistics. Everything is very close by. So is the responsibility over? But then you have to think deeper, right? And then we go into what's the mindset of a library, the metaphor, the generative metaphor, right? So the generative metaphor, actually, if you go, it's more explicit. One of the good things about the 19th century is that they were very open about their bad thoughts. So they were clearly articulated, which we are very much more sensitive about, being politically correct and so on. But they basically the basic metaphor is the library is the teacher, librarian is the teacher, and the person who comes in is the student, and the sensibilities are middle class, and the furniture, the ambience, and the other telling thing is they actually know, at least from what I can make out, hardly anything about who doesn't come. So they haven't even systematically tried to find out who doesn't come. There's some scattered surveys. And so I think, and there have been critiques. The union leadership has criticized libraries for having a very alienating environment to a blue-collar worker. And so what else should the library be, right? And the other way of looking at the library would be, maybe it should be like a tool shed, there are a lot of tools around, and people come and do their stuff, like maybe the maker space, which is the upper end now. People come around, and then there are people who help them do what they want. And to be fair, I saw my local library now has they have a library of things. It's kind of interesting. They have a room now with a bunch of things. So it can't be my book. So they are they are on their own, figuring some things out on their own. So yeah.
I have plenty more questions, but I just want to.
Yeah, Ralph, we can take a question from the audience. Sure. I want us to stick to the tradition of the Jeff is to allow some interaction from the audience.
Yeah,
even though we're streaming live, if you're asking questions, your questions are going to be streamed live to the world. So just be prepared. So I guess, David, you have a question?
It's very interesting. So let me just extrapolate a little what you said and deal with the issue of resilience. Universal access to resilience. Okay, we're in a transformative industry.
Interesting.
How do you respond to universal access to resilience? I'll give you a little hint. Distributed generation, microgrids. So help me understand how we would address the issue of universal access to resilience. Since we're all concerned about climate change, all the challenges that are created from climate change, all the interruptions of electric service, help me understand how we would apply what you said to us today to universal access to resilience.
So David, I've never heard that term, and I'm awed by the term. It's a great term, universal access to resilience. I don't have an answer. Maybe you have some thoughts, and I can play with those. Maybe you can help me out. You promised me you will.
I did. Did I really? I don't remember that. Well, it brings up a broader question, right? Because there are ways to enhance reliability and resilience. Undergrounding. Well, that's doable in Washington. It's a little bit tougher in Nebraska. Backup generation, that's possible for a large industrial user. It's a little bit more expensive at the residential level. The issue becomes, in my mind at least, who pays, right? So clearly there are benefits to the individual, and they should pay for some of that, and there are benefits to society, and they should pay for some of that. But how much, and who's the they? I mean, if I choose to live in a beautiful wilderness area, then should I really expect somebody who's struggling to pay their monthly rent, maybe even making minimum wage in an urban area, to pay for my resilience? And there's no easy way to answer that. Obviously, that's the purpose of public policy and debate. It does.
I think it's a wonderfully put question. So yeah, there's disparity in resilience. I've never heard of that, but that's a very interesting way of thinking. And we can see in the United States, we can see the commercial entities have power supply which is much more resilience than a household, a neighborhood. So there's a disparity there, and it's kind of warranted. But if people are going to live at home and work from home, then that's an issue. But I think it's a big issue around the world. I know for sure, because that's when I look at the statistics and they say only about 700 million people don't have electricity. I don't buy it, because there are a lot of places in the world, there is no resilient power supply, and their power is not available for half a day. We can't imagine in the United States. So what is that connection if I can't have a refrigerator? I mean, so what will be the solution? I can tell you from the network, internet, telephone, the communications world. So one model of resilience was the Bell system model. And the Bell system model, they used to call them Bell heads. They all had, I was a great fan of Bell company as a whole. But and I think there's a parallel with the electrical utility world, because they were a very engineering culture, and they were very proud of reliability and security. And you can see it even today, people like to use fax. They're highly secure than the internet. And that was built into the engineering mind. But then what threw them off gear was something what's happening with the mini grids right here, is the Silicon Valley mindset, where they started local area networks, and local area networks became expanded. It's a whole different mindset. They're flatter networks. So the Bell system was very hierarchical, and the computer industry has resilience, and you can see it in the design of the internet itself, is by having multiple paths. So it's not that any one path is resilient, unlike the telephone world. They have alternate paths. But how do you, in a scarce, economically scarce world, where they barely can get a single connection, how do you provide multiple paths? I do not know. But that's what's making me think. It could be a combination of some level of solar panels and rooftop and centrally powered supply, because the reality most probably is going to be when the utilities fully gear up, they'll generate economies of scale and technological advances just because they have the resources, the capital resources, and also ability to marshal human talent. That at some point, maybe that's a matter of public policy. Maybe they incentivize the utilities to also do things that will help mini grids. So, I don't know, I'm rambling here. So,
two stories come to mind on the resilience front. We had an event, as many of you remember, called Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region 10 years ago now. And somehow, miraculously, my house did not lose power. I was CEO at the time. There may not have been a miracle in that. And we had a lot of fans. It turned out my son was a senior in high school, so all of his classmates came over to do their college applications because we had power. I was not home for 3 days, 4 days, I don't remember what it was. But my wife kept getting visited by some neighbors who were furious that they did not have power. They were more furious that we did have power. And they were in their 80s. We don't know how they kept making their way to the house to complain all the time. And
so Ralph, can I ask you, how did your house, of course you were the CEO, but you had two lines? I mean, how did you have resilience? You had a special
there was
line?
some very good construction practices that were followed. I didn't order it. It just happened, seemed right about 6 months after I took the position. So, yeah. And I think the second story I'll never forget, as I got emails during Superstorm Sandy, and I would respond to all of them saying how hard
it's part of public record. It'll show up in my papers one day.
about how hard our employees were working to restore power. And then I received a follow-up email from a customer who started with, thank you for your very thoughtful email response. It was very kind of you to take the time to tell me how hard your employees were working, but you must be the worst CEO on the face of the planet because my power's still been out 2 weeks. And that was the end of the email. So the purpose of those two stories is not to fill time, but resilience matters. but it is a question of who pays for it, right, David? Any other questions?
One more
Yeah,
question.
please. One more?
Anyone has a question?
That's always the best way to end questions, by saying one more question, and then nobody wants to do the last question. Can we have one here? Your table 4?
Yeah. Hello, and thank you so much for this dialogue. It's very much appreciated. I think the gentleman mentioned climate or the resilience, universal resilience angle. So I think me and Cypher, we were just discussing this just before lunch. And I think as we were thinking and debating the fact that interconnected microgrids and and peer-to-peer power trading, because I think we're reaching so where Africa can leapfrog with cell phones, and we're going to come to the realization that blockchain technologies are already, the youth are already looking into that. So that would be something where you're going to have climate change creating havoc, but at the same time you can create these you can marshal some of the latest innovations to allow to address climate resilience or power systems failures sometimes. So just want to share that thought, and thank you for this dialogue.
Yeah, one of the issues I think that we'll see, Harmeet, around microgrids is, as you know, electricity, both its generation and its delivery, are very capital intensive. In fact, the delivery of electricity is essentially zero marginal cost, right? I mean, notwithstanding the required maintenance. And yet, whenever you have a capital intensive industry, asset utilization determines the economics. And unfortunately, my septuagenarian neighbors use their power 30% of the time. The hotel might use it 90% of the time. The hospital uses it 90%. So the microgrid really is an exercise at a micro level, forgive me, of who is subsidizing who.
Interesting. Yeah.
If you have a low-income residential community, they simply cannot afford a microgrid. If you have a high net worth residential community, they can afford a microgrid, but that doesn't seem fair. If you have an industrial park, they can afford a microgrid. This is the issue, obviously, with distributed solar. If I'm not home and my panel isn't providing my home, I really want it connected to somebody who is home and can use that power. Otherwise, I've got a wasted resource. So the interconnectivity is what we rely on as vertically integrated utilities to improve what we call the load factor, so that it wasn't quite as explicit as it was in the AT&T long lines case. You have high load factor customers subsidizing low load factor customers. Yeah. And that's just the way in which society wants to do things, which I don't quarrel with. Any other questions or comments? If not, please join me in thanking Professor Sawhney.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so stay in your seats. I'm going to just ask Ralph and the professor to get their mics off, and we get the next panel up on stage. So in the next 3 minutes, we'll start again.
If you think about the typical kind of business models, we've got one of everything. So we've got a transmission only, distribution only, vertically integrated couple there, and then mix those things